labeled grumpy at 72, then a lost child, saw her true heart. Welcome back and enjoy the story. The last rays of autumn sunlight strained through the dusty windows of Kathy's small house on Maple Street. At 72, Kathy Harrison had become a fixture in the neighborhood, though not in the way anyone would wish to be remembered. Children hurried past her crooked fence, whispering "witch" under their breath. Adults averted their eyes when she approached at the grocery store. The mailman left her letters haphazardly stuffed in the box, sometimes even on rainy days. Kathy's wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she placed her teacup on the windowsill, watching the world that had decided she wasn't worth kindness anymore. "Just you and me today," she whispered to Mr. Whiskers, the aging tabby who had been her only companion for nearly a decade. The cat purred softly, rubbing against her ankle, unaware of how the neighborhood children claimed he was her familiar who helped cast spells on disobedient youngsters. Kathy sighed, her breath fogging the window glass. The truth was far less mysterious than the neighborhood gossip suggested. She hadn't always been the neighborhood pariah. Once her home had echoed with laughter, with the thundering footsteps of her son, Frank, racing down the hallway, with her husband David's deep chuckle as he read the Sunday comics. But that was before the accident, before the crushing weight of grief had transformed her into someone unrecognizable even to herself. That evening, as Kathy pruned her solitary rosebush, the last living memory from the garden David had lovingly tended, she heard Mrs. Peterson from next door speaking to another neighbor. "It's just sad, really," Mrs. Peterson's voice carried. "Over the fence, not quite quiet enough. Some people just make it impossible to care about them. Always scowling, never a kind word. No wonder she's alone." The words stung, but Kathy had grown accustomed to the ache. She didn't bother explaining that her perpetual frown came from arthritis that twisted her face with pain, not from bitterness, though she had plenty of reasons for that too. She didn't tell them how isolation had become a safety mechanism after heartbreak had shattered her world. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted. If you're enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content. For you, continuing. Each morning followed the same routine. Kathy would wake at 6, prepare a simple breakfast, water her rosebush, and sit on the porch, watching neighborhood children wait for their school bus. Some would point and giggle, others would cross to the opposite side of the street. Today was no different, except for the darkening clouds gathering overhead, promising a substantial downpour. By mid-morning, the rain fell in sheets, drumming against Kathy's roof with unrelenting force. She was checking for leaks in the attic, a ritual during every major storm, when she heard something unusual, a whimpering sound coming from her front porch. Grabbing her shawl, Kathy made her way downstairs, every step sending jolts of pain through her arthritic knees. She opened the door cautiously, expecting perhaps a stray animal seeking shelter. Instead, she found a small boy, no older than 6, huddled against her front door, soaking wet and shivering violently. His bright yellow raincoat was torn at the sleeve, and tears streamed down his face, mingling with the raindrops. For a moment, they stared at each other, the boy's eyes wide with fear, Kathy's with shock. She recognized him as one of the children who regularly taunted her from a safe distance. You're the witch," he stammered through chattering teeth, but made no move to run. "And you're soaking wet," Kathy replied, her voice rusty from disuse. Something in her chest shifted as she looked at the terrified child. Without thinking, she opened the door wider. "Come inside before you catch pneumonia." The boy hesitated, clearly weighing the danger of entering the witch's house against the reality of the freezing rain. Another clap of thunder made the decision for him. He darted inside, keeping as much distance between himself and Kathy as the small entryway allowed. As Kathy closed the door against the howling wind, she wondered what her neighbors would say. If they knew she had captured one of their children, the thought almost made her smile for the first time in weeks. Will Kathy win the frightened boy's trust, or will his presence in her home only confirm the neighborhood's worst suspicions about the witch of Maple Street? "What's your name?" Kathy asked, reaching for a clean towel from the linen closet. The boy remained frozen in place, water pooling beneath his mud-caked sneakers. "Freddie," he finally managed. "Freddie Morrison." Kathy recognized the last name immediately. The Morrisons lived 3 blocks over. Dorothy Morrison was among the loudest voices warning others about that Harrison woman. "Well, Freddie Morrison," Kathy said, handing him the towel without getting too close. "You can dry yourself while I make some hot chocolate, then we'll call your mother." Freddie took the towel hesitantly, as if expecting it to transform into snakes in his hands. You're not going to cast a spell on me?" he asked in a small voice. The question struck Kathy like a physical blow. How deeply had these ridiculous stories permeated the neighborhood? She sighed heavily. "The only spell I know is how to make hot chocolate appear in an empty mug," she replied, turning toward the kitchen to hide the hurt in her eyes. As she busied herself with heating milk and finding the cocoa powder she rarely used anymore, she heard Freddie's cautious footsteps following her into the kitchen. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, a sound this house hadn't heard from a child since Frank was alive. The thought sent a painful jolt through Kathy's heart. "Why were you out in this storm?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Freddie, now somewhat drier but still shivering, perched on the edge of a kitchen chair. "I was walking home from Jimmy's house. Mom said to come straight home before the storm, but we were finishing our comic book. Then it started raining really hard, and I tried to run, but I fell and got all turned around." His lower lip trembled. "I don't even know where I am now." Kathy placed a steaming mug of cocoa before him, topped with the last 3 marshmallows, from a package she'd bought months ago and nearly forgotten. "You're on Maple Street," she said. "Your house is on Oak Drive, isn't it? About 3 blocks that way." She pointed through the kitchen window, though nothing was visible through the torrential rain. Freddie nodded, cautiously sipping the hot chocolate. His eyes widened slightly, perhaps surprised that it tasted normal, not like some witch's brew. Kathy reached for her ancient rotary phone. "I'm calling your mother now. She must be worried sick." But when she lifted the receiver, there was no dial tone, just dead silence. The storm must have knocked out the phone lines. She looked out, the window at the increasingly violent storm, then back at the small boy who was starting to look less terrified and more exhausted. "The phone's not working," she explained. "We'll have to wait until either the phones come back or the storm. Let's up enough for me to walk you home." Freddie's eyes filled with fresh tears. "But my mom will be so scared and—" He hesitated, looking down at his mug. "She told me never to talk to you. She says you're dangerous." At the end of Chapter 6, darkness was falling rapidly, making the storm outside seem even more menacing. The wind howled around the eaves of Kathy's small house, and tree branches scraped against the windows like skeletal fingers. Freddie had finished his hot chocolate and now sat curled in the armchair by the fireplace, wrapped in a faded quilt that Kathy had pulled from the cedar chest in her bedroom. Though still wary, his fear had given way to curiosity as he glanced around the living room at the photographs on the mantel. "Who's that boy?" he asked suddenly, pointing to a framed picture of a smiling teenager with Kathy's eyes. The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Kathy considered ignoring it. But something about the storm, the unexpected company, or perhaps just decades of silence made her answer. "That was my son," she said quietly. "What will Freddie discover about the mysterious woman the whole neighborhood fears? And could this unexpected encounter during the storm change both their lives forever?" The word "was" hung heavy in the air. Freddie looked at the photograph with new interest, then back at Kathy, whose face had softened with a grief so palpable it seemed to fill the room. "What happened to him?" Freddie asked with the direct curiosity only children possess. Kathy sank into the chair opposite him, her joints protesting. For years, she had avoided speaking Frank's name aloud, as if saying it might somehow make the loss more real. Yet here she was, about to share her deepest wound with a 6-year-old stranger who, until an hour ago, had thought her capable of casting evil spells. "His name was Frank," she began slowly. "He was 17 when a drunk driver hit his car on prom night." She paused, surprised by how steady her voice remained despite the trembling in her hands. "My husband David couldn't bear it. He left 2 years later, just packed a bag and wrote a note saying he couldn't do this anymore." Freddie's eyes widened. "So you've been all alone? For how long?" Kathy looked at the photograph, calculating. "Almost 30 years now." The words seemed impossible even as she spoke them. 3 decades of solitude, of neighbors turning into strangers, of becoming the subject of childish folklore rather than a woman with a broken heart. A loud crack of thunder made Freddie jump, clutching the quilt tighter around his shoulders. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Mum must be really worried by now." As if on cue, there was a pounding at the door that made them both start. Kathy rose stiffly and made her way to the entryway. When she opened the door, she found Dorothy Morrison on her doorstep, drenched and frantic, accompanied by a police officer with a rain-slicked poncho. "Where is he?" Dorothy demanded, pushing past Kathy without waiting for an invitation. "Freddie!" Her cry of relief when she spotted her son was followed immediately by suspicious fury as she turned back to Kathy. "What is he doing here? Did you lure him somehow?" The police officer, a young man who looked uncomfortable to be caught in this situation, stepped between them. "Ma'am, your son appears to be fine. Let's all just calm down." Freddie scrambled off the chair and ran to his mother. "Mom, I got lost in the storm, and Miss Kathy helped me. She gave me hot chocolate and told me about her son who died." Dorothy looked from her son to Kathy with confusion, as if unable to reconcile the neighborhood witch with this new information. The officer cleared his throat. "Mrs. Morrison, I think we should get your boy home now. The storm's letting up a bit, but they're saying another cell is moving in." Dorothy nodded, still eyeing Kathy warily as she ushered Freddie toward the door. Just before leaving, Freddie pulled away from his mother and ran back to Kathy. "Thank you for the hot chocolate," he said, then added in a whisper, "I don't think you're a witch anymore." He darted back to his mother before Kathy could respond. As the door closed behind them, Kathy found herself alone again in the suddenly silent house. She walked slowly back to the living room and picked up the empty cocoa mug, still warm from Freddie's small hands. For the first time in years, the emptiness of her home felt noticeable, as if Freddie's brief presence had awakened her to just how solitary her existence had become. Have you ever misjudged someone based on appearances or rumors, only to discover a completely different truth later? Share your experience in the comments below. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having washed the world clean. Kathy was surprised to find her gate, usually creaking and neglected, had been propped back onto its hinges. She assumed the wind must have shifted it into a temporarily stable position, but as she bent to examine it, she noticed fresh mud at the base. Someone had deliberately set it upright. While she was still pondering this, the mail truck pulled up. Instead of the usual hasty deposit that left her letters crumpled, the mailman, a young man who had taken over the route last year, actually walked to her door and handed her the small bundle personally. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrison," he said, with a nod before returning to his vehicle. Kathy stood frozen on her porch, the simple courtesy having caught her completely off guard. Later that afternoon, as Kathy pruned her rose bush, she sensed someone watching her. Looking up, she spotted Freddie standing uncertainly at the newly fixed gate, his mother a few steps behind him. Dorothy Morrison's face was a complex mixture of embarrassment and determination. "Freddie wanted to bring you something," she explained. Stiffly, the boy stepped forward, holding out a slightly squashed cupcake with blue frosting. "I told Mom you're not really a witch," he announced proudly. "I told everybody at school, too." Kathy accepted the cupcake, her throat suddenly tight. That's very kind of you, Freddie." Dorothy cleared her throat. "I also wanted to thank you properly for helping him during the storm, and to apologize for my reaction." The words seemed difficult for her to say, but genuine nonetheless. After they left, Kathy sat on her porch steps, staring at the cupcake. In wonder. Such a small thing, yet it felt monumental. That evening, as she watered her rose bush, she noticed something unusual. A small plant had been placed beside it, its roots freshly covered with soil. A tag attached to one of the stems read simply, "From Freddie, it's a begonia." The gesture brought tears to Kathy's eyes. She hadn't planted anything new in her garden since David left. Over the next few days, subtle changes continued. Mrs. Peterson waved from her yard instead of turning away. The grocery clerk, who had always ignored her, actually asked if she needed help reaching the top shelf. Children still stared, but with curiosity rather than fear. It was as if Freddie's story had humanized her, transforming her from a neighborhood, a bogeyman, into simply an old woman with a sad history. On Sunday, Kathy was startled by another knock at her door. This time it was Pastor Roberts and his wife bearing a casserole. "We missed you at services," the pastor said kindly, though Kathy hadn't attended church since Frank's funeral. "And Ellen here makes too much food every Sunday." Ellen Roberts, who had once commented loudly about how some people were too hard to love, now stood on Kathy's porch with a dish of food and remorse in her eyes. "It's nothing special," she said, "just chicken and rice." But they both knew it was more than that. It was an overture, an acknowledgement of years of unnecessary isolation that the community had helped create. Will the neighborhoods change, of heart continue, or will old habits return once the novelty of seeing Kathy in a new light wears off? And more importantly, can Kathy herself break through decades of self-imposed isolation to accept the community's tentative offerings of connection? The following Saturday brought another surprise. Kathy was reading in her living room when a commotion outside drew her attention. Peering through the curtains, she saw Freddie and 3 other children standing by her front gate, seeming to argue among themselves. Cautiously, she opened the door. The children fell silent immediately, 4 pairs of eyes turning to her with varying degrees of apprehension. Freddie was the first to speak. "Miss Kathy, we're playing explorers, and I told them your house isn't haunted or anything. Can we see inside, please?" The request so shocked Kathy that for a moment she couldn't respond. Children asking to enter her home willingly? When she finally found her voice, she surprised herself by saying, "I suppose," for a little while. The children's visit was chaotic and overwhelming, full of questions, exclamations, and energy that Kathy's small house hadn't contained in decades. They marveled at her old record player. "It's like in the museum." Asked about black and white photographs. "Is that really you? You were pretty." And were especially fascinated by Mr. Whiskers, who tolerated their attention with surprising patience. When Freddie spotted the chess set gathering dust on a shelf, his eyes lit up. "My grandpa taught me this. Can you play?" Before she quite knew what was happening, Kathy found herself engaged in a clumsy game of chess with a 6-year-old, while 3 other children offered enthusiastic but entirely incorrect advice from the sidelines. After the children left, promising, somewhat alarmingly, to return soon, Kathy sat in her suddenly quiet house, feeling strangely energized rather than drained. The next day, Dorothy Morrison appeared again, this time with an invitation to a neighborhood barbecue. "The kids haven't stopped talking about your chess set and your record collection," she explained with a small smile. "I thought maybe, well, it might be nice to have you there." Kathy's instinct was to decline immediately. The thought of facing an entire neighborhood of people who had spent years avoiding her was terrifying. But Dorothy seemed to sense her hesitation. "Freddie would be disappointed if you didn't come," she added softly. "He's told everyone his Miss Kathy is coming." His Miss Kathy. The simple possessive pronoun awakened something long dormant in Kathy's heart. To be claimed, to belong to someone's world again, even in this small way, felt like a hand reaching into the darkness where she had been living. "I'll think about it," she promised, which was more than she would have offered just weeks before. After Dorothy left, Kathy found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. She opened the cedar chest containing her good clothes, wondering if any of them were still suitable for a public appearance. As she sorted through the garments, her fingers brushed against something wrapped in tissue paper. Carefully unfolding it, she revealed David's old Polaroid camera, a relic from happier times when they had documented every moment of Frank's childhood with enthusiastic, if amateurish, photography. The next few days brought an internal struggle unlike anything Kathy had experienced in years. Part of her longed to attend the barbecue, to step back into the world of the living. Another part, the protective shell she had built around her grief, resisted fiercely. What if they were only inviting her out of pity? What if the kindness was temporary? What if opening herself to connection only meant opening herself to new pain? But as she watered her rosebush and Freddie's begonia on Saturday morning, the day of the barbecue, she noticed something remarkable. The begonia had not only survived, but was thriving, its bright red flowers a vivid contrast to the pale pink roses. Something new was growing alongside the old, not replacing it but complementing it. Will Kathy find the courage to attend the neighborhood barbecue? And if she does, can she truly begin to rebuild connections after decades of isolation? Or will the weight of her past continue to keep her separate from those around her? The decision came suddenly as Kathy was getting dressed that afternoon. On impulse, she reached for the Polaroid camera, checking that it still contained film. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, she applied a touch of lipstick. Something she hadn't done since David left. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, older certainly, with deep lines etched by grief, but with a spark in her eyes that had been absent for too long. The walk to the community park was only 3 blocks, but for Kathy it might as well have been miles. Each step required conscious effort, not just because of her arthritis, but because each one took her further from the safety of isolation and closer to the risk of human connection. The barbecue was in full swing when she arrived. Children raced. Across the grass, adults clustered around picnic tables laden with food, and the air was filled with the scent of grilling meat and the sound of laughter. For a moment, Kathy stood at the periphery, unnoticed and fighting the urge to turn back. Then a small voice shouted, "Miss Kathy came!" Freddie was racing toward her, his face alight with genuine joy. Behind him, conversations paused as heads turned in her direction. Kathy clutched the camera like a shield, regretting her decision immediately. But then Dorothy was beside her, gently guiding her toward a table. "I'm so glad you made it," she said, and the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. The afternoon unfolded with a surreal quality. Mrs. Peterson brought her a plate of food without being asked. Pastor Roberts introduced her to new families who had moved to the neighborhood after she had already become a recluse. Ellen Roberts apologized properly, tears in her eyes as she admitted, "We should have checked on you. After David left, we should have been there." Most surprisingly, Kathy found herself sharing stories about Frank, small anecdotes about his childhood misadventures that had once been too painful to recall, but now brought smiles through the tears. And when she tentatively took out David's old camera and offered to take pictures, the gesture was met with enthusiasm. By the time twilight descended and the party began to disperse, Kathy had a stack of developing Polaroids and something she hadn't possessed in 30 years, a sense of belonging. As Dorothy walked her home, Freddie skipping ahead of them, she confessed, "I nearly didn't come today." Dorothy nodded, understanding. "I wouldn't have either, in your shoes. We weren't kind to you, Kathy. The neighborhood decided who you were without ever asking." They paused at Kathy's gate, which now hung straight on its newly repaired hinges. "Freddie sees people differently," Dorothy continued. "Children often do. They haven't learned all our awful adult habits yet." The next morning, Kathy woke with purpose for the first time in years. After breakfast, she carefully arranged the Polaroids from the barbecue on her mantel, alongside the photographs of Frank and David. Then she did something even more significant. She called a landscaping service. When the young man arrived to give an estimate, she walked him around her small yard. "I want it all redone," she explained. "Keep the rose bush and the begonia there, but the rest can go. I'm thinking a garden, something colourful." The landscaper seemed surprised but pleased. "Any particular flowers you had in mind, Mom?" Kathy thought for a moment. "Whatever attracts butterflies," she decided, "and maybe a small bench for visitors." Have you ever taken a courageous step to reconnect with others after a period of isolation? What challenges did you face? Share your thoughts in the comments. The transformation of Kathy's yard became a neighborhood project. What started as a professional landscaping job evolved when Freddie asked if he could help plant some of the flowers. Then Jimmy from across the street wanted to join. Soon, Kathy found herself hosting impromptu gardening lessons for half a dozen children, with parents stopping by to check on things, but staying to dig holes and offer gardening advice. Mr. Jenkins, a retired carpenter from the next block, built not just one bench but two, positioning them beneath the shade of Kathy's old maple tree. "For when you have company," he explained gruffly, as if embarrassed by his own generosity. Inside, her home changes were happening too. Kathy brought out photo albums that had been stored away for decades, sharing them with Freddie and any other children who expressed interest. She told stories about Frank as a boy, about David teaching him to ride a bicycle on this very street, about family picnics in the park where the barbecue had been held. Speaking these memories aloud seemed to transform them from wounds into treasures, still tender to touch but precious rather than merely painful. One afternoon, as she showed Freddie a photograph of Frank with his high school chess team, the boy asked innocently, "Do you think your son would have liked me?" The question caught Kathy off guard, tears springing to her eyes before she could stop them. "Oh, Freddie," she whispered, "he would have absolutely adored you." As summer progressed, Kathy's home became something of a neighborhood hub. Parents discovered that she was a reliable source of Band-Aids, popsicles, and surprisingly good advice for dealing with childhood dramas. Children learned that her bookshelves contained fascinating old volumes with illustrations unlike anything in their modern books. Even Mr. Whiskers benefited from the change, receiving more attention and treats than he quite knew what to do with. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in Kathy herself. The perpetual frown that had once been attributed to bitterness now visibly softened. She still felt pain, physical from her arthritis, emotional from her losses, but it no longer defined her entire existence. Will Kathy's newfound connections with the neighborhood bring healing not just to her present life, but to her painful past? And as summer begins to wane, can these relationships withstand the changing seasons? Dorothy found Kathy on her front porch one evening as summer was turning to autumn, the air carrying the first hint of coolness after months of heat. "You've created quite the fan club," Dorothy remarked, settling beside her on one of Mr. Jenkins' benches. Freddie insists that when he grows up, he's going to live next door to you forever. Kathy laughed, another sound that had become less foreign to her lately. I should be thanking you, she said after a moment, if you hadn't encouraged me to come to that barbecue. Dorothy shook her head. You made that choice yourself. It couldn't have been easy, facing all of us after years of... She trailed off, not wanting to directly acknowledge the community's role in Kathy's isolation. After years of being the neighborhood witch, Kathy supplied wryly. It's all right. We can say it now. She gazed out at her garden, now bursting, with late summer blooms and, true to her request, attracting butterflies that danced from flower to flower in the evening light. I let it happen, she admitted quietly. After David left, I just stopped trying. It was easier to be alone than to risk caring about anyone else. Dorothy's eyes filled with understanding. Grief does different things to different people. Some get louder, demanding the world hear their pain. Others get quiet, like you did. Neither way is wrong. The simple acceptance in those words felt like a balm to wounds Kathy hadn't realized were still raw. Their conversation was interrupted by Freddie racing up the walk, waving a paper excitedly. Miss Kathy, I got an A on my essay about you, he announced proudly. Dorothy looked mortified. Freddie, you didn't tell Miss Kathy you were writing about her for school, but Kathy was already reaching for the paper, curious despite her surprise. The assignment had been to write about a community hero, and Freddie had chosen her. In his childish handwriting, he had described not the neighborhood witch, but a brave lady who lost her family but still helps everyone and makes the best hot chocolate and knows everything about butterflies and old music. The essay concluded, Miss Kathy shows that you can be really sad but still be kind. That's what makes her my hero. Kathy couldn't speak, tears streaming unchecked down her cheeks as she handed the paper back to Freddie, who looked alarmed. Did I say something wrong? He asked anxiously. Kathy shook her head vigorously, opening her arms. After a brief hesitation, Freddie stepped into her embrace, the first time he had actually hugged her, despite all the time they had spent together over the summer. These are happy tears, she assured him, her voice thick with emotion. Sometimes words are so special they make your heart too full, and some of that fullness spills out through your eyes. Over Freddie's head, her gaze met Dorothy's, who was wiping away tears of her own. That night, alone in her house that somehow no longer felt empty, Kathy did something she hadn't done in decades. She wrote a letter to Frank. Not to mail, of course, but as a way to bridge the years of silence between them. My dearest son, she began, her hand shaking slightly. Today a 6-year-old boy called me his hero. I wish you could have met him. He reminds me of you in so many ways. Curious, kind, seeing the world with such clear eyes. She wrote about the garden, about taking up photography again with David's old camera, about rediscovering parts of herself she thought had died along with him. I've spent 30 years keeping your memory in a locked room, she confessed on paper. I thought it was the only way to survive, but I'm learning that remembering can be a garden instead of a tomb, that your life, however brief, can still bring beauty to this world through me. As autumn deepened into winter, Kathy faced a new challenge, her first holiday season as part of the community rather than apart from it. For decades, she had kept her curtains drawn on Thanksgiving and Christmas, pretending the celebrations happening around her weren't real or didn't matter. Now Dorothy was asking if she would join their family for Thanksgiving dinner. The children were planning a holiday pageant and wanted her to help with costumes because she knew about old-fashioned things. Pastor Roberts wondered if she might be willing to share some of her photographs for a community history display at the church's Christmas fair. Each invitation brought both joy and terror. Joy at being included, terror at how much it would hurt if this all somehow disappeared. Again, What will Kathy decide about these holiday invitations? Can she fully embrace becoming part of community celebrations that have been sources of pain for so many years? And will the neighborhood's change of heart toward her prove lasting when, tested by time and deeper relationships? Snow fell softly outside Kathy's window as she carefully wrapped small presents on her dining table, a chess set for Freddie, vintage costume jewelry for his sister Emma, handwritten recipe cards for Dorothy, bird feeders for the Jenkins, and various small tokens for the other neighbors who had become part of her life. The simple act of holiday shopping, something she hadn't done since Frank's last Christmas, had been both painful and exhilarating. Each gift represented a thread connecting her to someone else, a commitment to continuing relationships that could bring both joy and heartache. As she tied the final bow, the doorbell rang. Kathy opened it to find Ellen Roberts, the pastor's wife, standing on her snowy porch with an envelope in her gloved hands. "It's from the church council," Ellen explained as Kathy invited her in from the cold. "We're establishing a scholarship in Frank's name at the high school for students interested in chess and mathematics, like he was." Kathy sank slowly into her armchair, the envelope trembling in her hands. "How did you know about his interests?" she whispered. Ellen smiled gently. "You've been sharing stories all year, Kathy. We've been listening." Something about this simple statement broke the final barrier around Kathy's heart. The idea that her son was being remembered not just by her, but by an entire community that had never even met him, that his legacy might help other young people, seemed like a miracle she hadn't dared to hope for. Thanksgiving at the Morrisons. Home was chaotic, loud, and completely unlike any holiday Kathy had experienced in decades. Children raced around the house, while adults attempted to maintain conversations over the din. Food was abundant, much of it slightly imperfect. Rolls, a bit too brown on the bottom, gravy with a few lumps. It was nothing like the meticulously planned holidays Kathy had once hosted, and yet there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the overheated dining room. When Dorothy asked everyone to share something they were grateful for before the meal, Freddie announced without hesitation, "I'm thankful Miss Kathy isn't a witch after all, because she's way better as a real person." The laughter that followed had not a trace of mockery in it, only affection and agreement. Christmas brought the church pageant, where Kathy found herself backstage helping nervous children into costumes she had helped sew. Her arthritic hands struggled with small buttons and zippers, but no one complained about the extra time it took. Instead, parents thanked her repeatedly for her patience with their excited children. The display of historical photographs at the Christmas fair drew considerable attention, with many longtime residents discovering connections they hadn't known existed. "That's my grandfather's hardware store," one elderly man exclaimed, pointing to a background detail in one of Frank's childhood photos. "And look there, that sign for Johnson's Pharmacy. My first job was delivering prescriptions for Old Man Johnson." Each such discovery seemed to weave Kathy more firmly into the fabric of the neighborhood's shared history. New Year's Eve found Kathy hosting her first gathering in over 30 years, a simple affair with hot chocolate for the children and mulled wine for the adults, as they all waited for midnight. Dorothy had helped her prepare, bringing extra chairs and insisting that everything didn't need to be perfect. "It's about being together," she reminded Kathy when a batch of cookies came out slightly overdone. As midnight approached, Kathy found herself surrounded by people who now called her friend, neighbor, Miss Kathy, people who knew her grief but no longer defined her by it. When Pastor Roberts raised his glass in a toast, he said simply, "To new beginnings and second chances." The words echoed in Kathy's heart as the clock struck 12 and a new year began. Spring came early that year, coaxing buds from Kathy's now extensive garden weeks before they usually appeared. On a particularly fine April morning, she sat on one of Mr. Jenkins' benches with a photo album open beside her. Freddie, now a frequent visitor even without his mother's supervision, peered over her shoulder at photographs of her garden from decades past. "It looks different now," he observed. "More butterflies." Kathy nodded, tracing the old photograph with a wrinkled finger. "That's because we planted different flowers. Frank liked roses best, like his father, but you children chose flowers that attract butterflies." "Is that okay?" Freddie asked, suddenly concerned that they might have changed something precious to her. "It's more than okay," Kathy assured him, wrapping an arm around his small shoulders. "Gardens are supposed to change. They grow with us." As the anniversary of Frank's accident approached, a day Kathy had spent alone in darkened rooms for decades, Dorothy suggested a different kind of remembrance. "What if we planted a tree for him, in the park where all the children play?" The idea had initially terrified Kathy, making her grief so public, inviting others into such a personal pain. But as she thought of how Frank had loved climbing trees, how he would have enjoyed watching children play beneath the branches, she found herself nodding. "He would have liked that," she admitted softly. The planting ceremony was simple but profound. Pastor Roberts said a few words. The children from the neighborhood helped shovel dirt around the young oak's roots, and Kathy placed a small chess piece, a knight, Frank's favorite, in the soil before the final covering. As they finished, Freddie slipped his hand into Kathy's. "Now we can visit him together sometimes," he said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that only children possess. Tears filled Kathy's eyes, but they weren't the bitter tears of isolated grief that had been her only companion for so long. These were different, still sad, but somehow warmed by the community surrounding her. That summer, Kathy celebrated her 73rd birthday, the first birthday party she had experienced in 30 years. The neighborhood gathered in her backyard, which was now an explosion of colors and fragrance. Mr. Whiskers, despite his advanced age, seemed rejuvenated by all the attention, strutting among the guests like royalty receiving his subjects. When Dorothy brought out a cake with too many candles to count, Kathy whispered, "I don't know if I can blow them all out." "That's why we're all here to help," Ellen Roberts replied with a gentle smile. "You don't have to do anything alone anymore, unless you want to." As autumn returned and the cycle of seasons completed itself, Kathy sat on her porch watching children in Halloween costumes parade up and down the street. Last year, they had avoided her house entirely. This year, her porch was decorated with pumpkins the neighborhood children had helped her carve, and her bowl of candy was already half empty from frequent visitors. Freddie, dressed as a knight, his current obsession after hearing stories about Frank's chess prowess, had insisted on staying to help her distribute treats. "You know," Kathy remarked as they waited for the next group of trick-or-treaters, "a year ago today, children were crossing the street to avoid my house." Freddie considered this seriously. "That's because they didn't know you yet," he concluded. "They were just scared of the story of you, not the real you." The wisdom in his simple observation struck Kathy deeply. How many times had she herself been guilty of the same? Accepting the stories others told, or worse, the stories she told herself, instead of looking for the reality behind them. After the children had all returned home and Freddie had been collected by Dorothy, Kathy took out her journal, another habit she had recently resumed. "Dear Frank," she wrote, "your mother is learning new things at 73. Imagine that. Today I learned that stories can imprison us if we let them, but they can also set us free." She paused, her pen hovering over the page. "I think my story is still being written, and for the first time in a very long time, I'm curious to see how it continues." The following spring, Kathy stood in her garden, supervising as Freddie and several other neighborhood children planted new flowers. Her arthritis, had worsened over the winter, making gardening increasingly difficult, but she found she didn't mind directing operations from her bench. There was joy in watching young hands do what hers no longer could, a continuation rather than an ending. "Miss Kathy," Freddie called, holding up a small, delicate plant. "Where should this one go?" "By the roses," she decided, after a moment's consideration. The old and the new side by side. As she watched the children working together, laughing and occasionally bickering amicably, Kathy reflected on the remarkable journey of the past year. The pain of losing Frank and David would never completely leave her. Those wounds were too deep for perfect healing. But alongside that pain now grew joy, connection, purpose. Her life had expanded beyond the narrow boundaries of grief to encompass a community that had become like family. That evening, as the neighborhood gathered for a potluck dinner in her backyard, now a regular occurrence, Kathy found herself surrounded by the sounds of life. Children's laughter, adults' conversations, the scrape of chairs and clink of dinnerware. Dorothy sat beside her, their friendship now comfortable enough for companionable silence. "I never thought I'd have this again," Kathy admitted quietly. "A place where I belong." Dorothy squeezed her hand gently. "You've taught us all something important, Kathy, about second chances, about how it's never too late to come back to life." As the sun set over her flourishing garden, casting a golden glow over faces both young and old, Kathy realized something profound. In saving her, this community had in some way saved itself, becoming more compassionate, more attentive to the forgotten ones in their midst. Her story of isolation had transformed into a story of connection that changed not just her life, but the life of an entire neighborhood. "Miss Kathy," Freddie called from across the yard, "tell us a story about when you were little." With a smile, Kathy beckoned the children closer. "Well," she began, "when I was about your age." As her voice carried through the garden she had once tended alone, now filled with people who knew her name and her heartaches and her joys, Kathy Harrison was no longer the witch behind the crooked fence. She was simply herself, a woman with a past full of both sorrow and joy, and a present rich with human connection. And for the first time in decades, she was genuinely curious about what the future might bring. Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.